Here we go. All right, we're ready. Finally, I'm ready. Finally. So, we're on chapter 17 of Matthew. So, I outlined the whole chapter. We'll see how we do, right? But we're going to take a look at what happens now after Peter's declaration of faith in the last chapter, and take a look at some interesting moment, this time and space and place together, and ask, Lord, for your Spirit to be present in our hearts and minds as we study your word together. Lord, guide and direct our thoughts and understanding to our good, but more importantly, to your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so as we talked about at the end of the last chapter, that moment at Caesarea Philippi when Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah is the central moment of Matthew's gospel. That's, if you will, it's the theological core of the gospel, the theological center. Whether it's the center in terms of words and whatnot, it's the theological center. Because everything that happens now in the gospel flows from that declaration, right? So Peter has declared, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And if we recall, there are differing ideas and differing expectations about what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. Differing ideas and differing expectations about what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. The disciples have one way of understanding it. Jesus' contemporaries have one way of understanding it, and Jesus has a wholly other way of understanding it. But everything that happens now is going to support Peter's declaration, but also serve to expand Jesus' understanding of it, what it means to be Messiah, in contrast to what the world believes about it. So chapter 17 begins with the story of the Transfiguration. And that story is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All three accounts, all three synoptic gospels have it. And all three gospels have about the same story. There aren't a whole lot of differences. But then following that brief story of the Transfiguration, Jesus begins to dig a little bit more into what that Transfiguration means. And then there's three little stories, I guess, that end the chapter that don't appear to be related, but they are. They say a little bit more about Jesus. So as we look at the text in chapter 17 and verse 1, we get one of those notations about time. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to the high mountain by themselves. So anytime you have a very specific time designation, pay attention, right? 6 days. Why 6 days? Well, 6 days tells us just about where Jesus is. So if they started out in Caesarea Philippi and they traveled for 6 days south toward Judea, that's going to put them right about at Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is in southern Galilee, about a 6 day journey from Caesarea Philippi, and one of the traditional places where it's believed the Transfiguration took place. Okay, so the Mount of the Transfiguration. There's actually three mountains that vie for being named that. But again, in Matthew 9 and Luke 9, we have the story. And again, Matthew's very, we haven't talked about this for a long time, since chapter 5. But Matthew's very interested in presenting Jesus as the new Moses, the new lawgiver. If you recall the Sermon on the Mount, right, in chapter 5, Jesus is delivering his summary of the law. Moses received the law on what? Mount Sinai, right? So there's a lot of similarities here, and Jesus' relationship with the law is at the center of much of his conflict with the religious opponents. But this moment of transfiguration, I think, is intended to help us or make us recall Moses' ascent of Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, to receive the law. If you read back into the story, Moses only took one person to the top of the mountain with him. I bet you didn't know he took anybody with him. He took Joshua with him to the top of the mountain to receive the law. Joshua, his assistant and eventual successor. Jesus takes 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. Who are these other disciples? We know who Peter is, right? Peter's an obvious choice. He's the rock upon which Jesus will build the church, right?
We have a newcomer.
Oh, fantastic.
Hi. Hi. Thank you.
You got one over there. Come on and have a seat. We're in Matthew chapter 17. That's it. So the lists of the disciples' names in the Bible can sometimes be confusing. But as we look at Matthew's account and we try to understand who these disciples were and why Jesus chose them, we get some clues. So Peter, we know Peter's the obvious one. But what about James and John? Right? There's a couple of different James in Jesus' group. And what the one we're most likely talking about here is the James who was executed by Herod early on in Acts. So he was the first of the disciples who died, who was executed.
Is he the one that wrote the book of James?
Yeah, don't quote me on that, but I think this James, the brother of the Lord, is the person we're talking about here. But geez, don't quote. No, it's James the son of Zebedee. There you go. It's a different James. James the son of Zebedee. I have to, let me look at my, I think I've got where the Acts 12. So if this James dies in Acts chapter 12, it can't be James the brother of the Lord, because James the brother of the Lord shows up in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council. Try to keep this all straight, right? Yeah.
Isn't he known as James the Lesser?
There was James the Just, James the Lesser, but yeah, absolutely. James the son of Zebedee would be James the Lesser because he's not James the brother of Jesus. Yeah. The proliferation of similar names and the lack of any surnames gets us into problems. But remember, James and John they were called the sons of thunder, right? The sons of Zebedee. And so in Acts chapter 12, we learn that this James was executed. So he serves in the narrative as the first of the disciples who dies for the faith. And if John here is John the beloved disciple, then John is the last disciple to die. He died in old age on the island of Patmos. But it's referring to both the leader of the church, that is Peter, and to the disciples who had a pivotal role in the initial spread of the gospel. But these 3 are singled out, and they'll be singled out again when Jesus goes to Gethsemane. He takes Peter, James, and John with him to wait while he prays. And of course, they are falling asleep. The disciples seem to have a case of narcolepsy every once in a while. But what are the similarities, right? So Moses goes up to the top of the mountain with Joshua to receive the law. Jesus goes up to the top of the mountain with Peter, James, and John, not to receive the law, but to talk to the lawgiver. That's Moses, who will appear with him. And so both accounts have a cloud, both accounts have Moses present, and we're told that this happened 6 days after Peter's declaration at Caesarea Philippi. Now you can make a very oblique link to the 6 days that the cloud overshadowed Mount Sinai before God spoke to Moses, but that's a stretch. What we're really doing here, and Luke says 8 days. Luke says about 8 days. So 8 days, 6 days, about a week, right? About a week. We don't want to get caught up too much in the exact number, but understand that what both accounts are trying to do, what all 3 accounts are trying to do, is give us a picture of Jesus on the move. And we know, because we know the rest of the gospel, that he's on the move now from far in the north, Caesarea Philippi, far in the north, down to Judea. By the time we reach the next chapter, that in fact is where he will be, in Judea. So, But I think what's really intentional here, why is this transfiguration happening so close to Peter's declaration at Caesarea Philippi? And I think it's because they are linked. Remember what Jesus said after Peter declared him to be the Messiah, the Son of the living God, right? And Jesus said, the Son of Man must suffer and die, right? And Peter said, no way, no how, right? So in that, of course, is in that statement that Jesus makes, Peter and the other disciples find reason to doubt. Peter's just made this declaration, right? You're the Messiah. But what does he expect the Messiah to do?
Revolution.
Yes, start a revolution. That's the Messiah's job, not to die. And this is encouraging to me. This whole struggle that the disciples have to understand is encouraging to me, because their obtuseness, their stubborn unwillingness to believe what Jesus has said has not left the church. Right? They struggle because they hear what they want to hear, but they don't hear what they don't want to hear. They love the part where Jesus is the Messiah, hoorah, hooray, right? But they hate the part where Jesus said, but the Messiah must die in Jerusalem. Wait, what? That doesn't make any sense at all. So again, traditionally Mount Tabor, and I thought this was interesting. I always like to look at what kind of symbolism did those places have in Judaism in the time of Jesus. And it turns out that Mount Tabor was a signal mountain. It was a mountain where the Jews in Jerusalem lit fire signals to let the villages in the north know when it was time to celebrate certain festivals and feasts, and when the new month began. So it was definitely a place where there was fire, right? So he goes up onto this mountain, and it says in verse 2, he was transfigured before them. And so that's a great word, right? His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. So what about that word transfigured? The Greek word is, we basically transliterate the Greek word to form our English word metamorphosis. So can you imagine if it said Jesus was metamorphosized before them? Wouldn't that be fun, trying to pronounce that? It's kind of a weird word, and it's a compound word, and there's just all kind of strange things about it. And the word is in the passive voice, and that means that it was something that was done to Jesus, not something that Jesus did. And that's important, right? If Jesus is given this heavenly appearance, the idea is not that he did it himself, but that God did it to him. God transformed him, transfigured him for some reason. And the reason I think is important, and we kind of begin to uncover it just a wee bit when we start to look at other places in the Bible, particularly the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, Daniel's reported as a couple of times as having seen one like the Son of Man. And this heavenly angel, this angelic figure, is described in ways that are similar to this description of Jesus. And the New Testament connection, of course, is the description of the risen Christ in Revelation chapter 1, which is much more detailed, but consistent with the picture of heavenly beings throughout the Bible. So face shining like the sun, clothes as white as light. The idea is that you're getting a glimpse of divine glory. You're getting a glimpse of divine glory. So the sense of the language and the words is that Jesus' appearance didn't change, but his appearance was enhanced. So that when they look at this figure with a shining face and bright white clothes, it's still obviously Jesus, right? They still recognize him. but they're seeing something different. And one way to look at this, right? So if you take the whole of Scripture and some of the things that Paul says about Jesus and his human and divine nature, one of the conclusions you can reach is that Jesus' earthly body was the veil over his divine nature, right? God with skin on, as an old friend of mine described it. God with skin on. Because we cannot withstand the full glory of God's presence in our current state. The glory of being in the sinful humans in the glory of God's presence cannot survive, right? So in order for the presence of God to survive amongst the people, it must be veiled, covered, clothed in some way. So what James, Peter, and John are given in this moment is a glimpse of Jesus post-resurrection, post-ascension, right? Because Jesus is talking about being glorified. The Son of Man will be glorified, he says. That's on the other side of the cross, right? The Son of Man will be killed, but in 3 days he will rise again, right? And be glorified. And I love 2 Peter 1. Let's look at that. I love this. So 2 Peter, I'm a traditional kind of guy, so I believe Peter wrote this. Other scholars will argue, but they're not right. I am. I'm kidding. 2 Peter 1. I love this, though. Think about this as Peter reporting this event years after the fact. In verse 16, he says, in 2 Peter 1, verse 16, for we do not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power. Here it is. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Verse 18, we ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. Right? So beautiful little vignette there. Peter describing his experience of Jesus at the Transfiguration. And in the moment, he didn't get it. But after the fact, he did. Right? He understood that what he was given the privilege of seeing was a glimpse of Jesus post the cross, post resurrection, post ascension.
Isn't that the same as what when John the Baptist baptized Jesus?
Yes, same voice came out of heaven. And that's a great question, Nellie, because again, if we look at the account of the baptism in Matthew's gospel, it's a wee bit ambiguous as to who actually heard the voice. But in this account, it's very clear that Peter, James, and John heard the voice. And the reference in 2 Peter to the sacred mountain, right, definitely tells us that this happened on a mountain, not on the riverbank. So there's some very significant differences there. But there's no question that that heavenly voice and the content of that voice that we'll see here in a moment, that God is affirming Peter's declaration about Jesus as the Messiah and also affirming Jesus' statements about what's going to happen to him when they reach Jerusalem, right? That it's not the start of a revolution in the sense that they hope, but it's the beginning of humanity's salvation with the death of Jesus on the cross. So we have this vision that they're seeing, and again, this real event that's taking place on the mountaintop, and it's good, and it's glorious, and it's wonderful, but Jesus isn't the only one who's going to appear there, right? In verse 3, it says, just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Wouldn't you love to know the content of that conversation? Right? So I'm glad that you asked, because we actually do. In Luke's gospel, in Luke's account, Luke chapter 9. Luke,
Peter, James, and John, did they see Moses and Elijah? Or
Yeah.
just Jesus?
no, they saw him. They saw him. And what's fun about that, Sheila, it's not only that they saw them, but they recognized them. They recognized them. So whatever their guise was, it was apparent to the disciples that they were seeing Moses and Elijah. Here's why, though, that they would be not very difficult for them to decide who those two men must have been. Because here's the rule. There's a rule, right? The rule is the only people who can come back from heaven are the people who went there without dying first. Right? So you can only come back, in the Jewish understanding, you can only come back bodily if you never died bodily. So there are three men in the Bible who that fits, right? First is Enoch, who after a very brief life of 325 years walked with God and was no more. So there's Enoch. And Enoch has a whole bunch of literature associated with him. The books of Enoch. Great fun reading. Confusing, but fun. The other one is, the obvious one is Elijah, right? And the Jewish people expected Elijah. Elijah was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind, right? While a fiery chariot was going across the sky. So the expectation in Judaism was that Elijah would come back and he would fulfill his prophetic role as the herald of Messiah. So he would come back and he would prepare for the coming of the Messiah, which is why so many people thought it was John the Baptist. Which, to show my hand, Jesus is actually going to affirm that John the Baptist was Elijah returned. Okay? So they can expect to see Elijah because Elijah didn't die. But what about Moses? Now this is fun. I love the story of Moses' end. Deuteronomy 34. Let me preface this, though, again with the tradition. The tradition was, according to tradition, it was long believed that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, Deuteronomy ends with Moses' death. So the traditional understanding is that Moses received a word from God about his death and wrote it down before he left. But in Genesis chapter 34, let me get my right section here. At verse 5, it says, "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab." Verse 5, 34 verse 5. "Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab." Who buried who? God buried Moses. God personally buried Moses in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Now, the rabbis, I love the rabbis. I love the rabbis. The rabbis look at this and say, okay, here's the thing. Moses didn't die. God told him he wasn't going to die, but Moses was too modest to record that God took him before he died. So Moses writes this little bit in here that can be interpreted all kinds of different ways. But the way the rabbis interpreted it was that you can't find Moses' grave because Moses didn't die. That instead of burying him, God took him to heaven. So Moses could return. And certainly Revelation, when it talks about the 2 prophets who return, Revelation thinks that one of those prophets is Moses. Okay? And there's a little bit of literature associated with Moses returning at the time of the Messiah's return. So the point being that if that is the common belief within Judaism, then as Peter, James, and John see these 2 men appear with Jesus, it's natural for them to think and believe that these 2 men are Moses and Elijah. Now, again, the practical reason for their return is that they were alive in heaven, but the theological reason for their return is what they represent. So Moses is the lawgiver. He represents the law. Elijah is representative of the prophets. What's interesting is there is no book of Elijah. Elijah's stories are told in 1st and 2nd Kings, right? So he doesn't have a book, but he's representative of all the prophets. And of course, there's the whole idea of his return at the end of time. So, yeah. So again, the transfiguration is not just this kind of miraculous event with no connection or explanation to what's transpired or what's about to occur. The transfiguration supports the declaration that Jesus is the Messiah, but also supports that everything that Jesus has done, will do, and is doing and will do is in fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Remember what Jesus said earlier in the gospel? I came not to abolish the law, but to complete it, to fulfill it. So the early church certainly understood that Jesus fulfilled every Old Testament prophecy having to do with the Messiah, and that he completed the law by showing how it could be followed, and following it completely. So in Luke 9, I don't know how I missed this. We skipped. In Luke 9, trying to keep all this stuff in my head and there's no room.
He spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem.
Very good. Yeah. They spoke about his departure, his exodus, they spoke about, well, I love, the NIV says they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. I love that. His departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. What's that mean? That means his death.
King James says deceased.
His decease, yeah, like what you read, yeah, his decease. The word actually means an exodus. The word is actually related to the Hebrew word for exodus, and that's not unintentional, that's not accidental, right? Because the exodus, what was the purpose of the exodus? To save Israel, to redeem Israel from slavery to the Egyptians. The purpose of Jesus' exodus, Jesus' death, is to free humanity from slavery to sin and death, right? So there's very much this connection that the death of Jesus is the new exodus, the death and resurrection. So it's very intentional. So did the disciples hear what they were talking about? I don't know, maybe. Certainly they learned what was being said later, but certainly, certainly it's to affirm what Jesus has been teaching about his role as Messiah. Not that he's to start a revolution in the military sense, but that Jesus is to bring about the fulfillment of prophecy in a way that it just kind of rattles them. And I love it because Jesus is reminding his disciples patiently, time and again, that the mission of the Messiah is to die for the sins of the people, and to be raised from the dead for their salvation. So Jesus talks about his mission fulfilling the law and the prophets back in chapter 5 and verse 17. All right. So I love Peter. Look at the next verse, verse 4. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Right? 3 little shelters. And I love that word for shelter. It can be just a hut made of loose branches or a very elaborate tent. The word has a wide range of meaning. But Peter's thinking, okay, we're up here on the mountaintop. It's going to get hot. Moses and Elijah are here for a visit. Let's make sure everybody's comfortable. Right? But I think there's more to it than that. See, I do think there's more to it than that. Because again, think about messianic expectation, right? Think about what the Jews expected to happen before Messiah came. And again, we have to dig in not just into Scripture, but we have to dig into the tradition. So the tradition held that Moses and Elijah would come and have some role to play in the Messiah's advent or arrival. So maybe, and take this for what you paid for it, maybe Peter believes that Elijah and Moses have returned not just for a visit, but they've returned to stay. To stay. Because they have a job to do. If Jesus is the Messiah, then Moses and Elijah need to get over to Jerusalem and start getting people ready. Right? So perhaps that's why he says we need to build a place for you all to hang out. I think that's possible, right? And so we want to see Peter's impetuousness here as appropriate given his beliefs, right? He's speaking for all the disciples. Ooh, Elijah's back. Let's make him comfortable, right? Let's make him comfortable, because he's got work to do. But then, right, while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him." I love that. Listen to him. Okay? And you can interpret that last little command in all kinds of ways. But I think what God is telling Peter, James, and John is they need to pay attention to what Jesus has been saying about his role as Messiah, and pay attention to what he will be saying about it. Okay? Pay attention is really what that's the sense that's conveying. But everything here is meant to make us recall God's appearances in Exodus. There's a very clear link between Jesus and Moses in Matthew's gospel. So you may recall that in Exodus 13, numerous times in Exodus, God is described as appearing to Israel in the form of a pillar of cloud by day. There are times when Moses goes to the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and a pillar of cloud descends on it. And that pillar of cloud is meant to represent the presence of God. Now, it's a cloud because if it's a dense cloud, you can't see through it. And that's a good thing. Because what it's doing is, it's not just symbolizing the presence of God, but it's hiding the presence, the full presence of God from those who are looking upon it. Scary thing, right? Scary thing. So the bright cloud that we see here becomes a visible symbol of God's presence. And why do we need that, right? We need that for a very practical reason. To use this deeply Old Testament symbol of God's presence is to identify the source of the voice that will now speak, right? Because he doesn't say, "Hello, this is God," right? What does he say? "This is my son," right? Who's my, right? It's God. They're going to assume that because of the cloud. So God says, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And all that is so important. It's the language of choice, the language of election, right? All those things meant to impress upon Peter, James, and John that Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah of God. And that they have to begin to change their way of looking at him. That they have to take Jesus for who he says he is, not who they want him to be. Does that make sense? That's a very, very key struggle. Not who we want Jesus to be, but who Jesus really is. Okay? So again, who do they want him to be? They want him to be a warrior king, right? Who is he? He's a suffering servant. So again, and I love the struggle because it's our struggle, right? It's our struggle. Trying to fit Jesus into that mold that they want him to fit into. They want him to be the one who does what they want him to do when they want him to do it. And how many times do we do that with God? Here's my agenda, God, bless it, right? So, again, I used to get down on Peter and the other disciples till I realized I was a lot like them. And I stopped after that, right? So I love these words. The disciples need to come to terms with their reluctance to accept Jesus for who Jesus says he is, not who they want him to be. So the voice comes out of the cloud, and here, Nellie, this gets back to your question, right? So the voice at the baptism may have only been audible to John the Baptist and Jesus, because we don't see much of a reaction. Here, when that voice comes out of the cloud, the reaction is instant. They fall on the ground. Part of that's fear, right? Part of that's very real fear that they cannot survive the unfiltered presence of God. God is close. God is in that cloud. What happens if God comes out of that cloud? Right? They're destroyed. This is, again, the Jewish understanding of it. So, but the words are the same. The words are the same. This is my Son, whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased. Same thing at the baptism. All that's added here is listen to him. Right? Pay attention. So verse 6, when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified, but Jesus came and touched them. I love that. Touched them. Because they're just on the ground. They're cowering. They're afraid. And I love that physical act. I love that physical act. That's not accidental. Why does he just say, get up, you knuckleheads? Right? Why doesn't he just do that? Right? Because he wants to reassure them. He wants to reassure them. Right? To understand that they're not in danger. There's more to come. But again, understandable. And that falling down to the ground, we don't get that in our current culture, but that's also an act of worship. It's not just fear and terror, but to fall flat on your face before the presence of the Lord is an act of worship. To say, God, you're up here and I'm down here. You're heaven and I'm dirt, and worship with that recognition of humility. But this is the moment now when Jesus is preparing Peter, James, and John to understand what's going to happen when they finally reach Jerusalem. So the conversation that we see now in the next verse is between Jesus and these three men. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Now, honestly, I wonder if they actually heard that. And if they heard it, if they understood it. Right?
They're probably still in a state of shock.
Yeah.
That they saw Moses and Elijah, they heard God's voice, and then all of a sudden, nothing,
Yeah.
except for Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
Where did everybody go?
Exactly. Where's Elijah?
Where's Moses?
Where's Moses? This is confusing.
They gotta
Right?
be-
This is confusing.
They gotta be scared.
Yeah.
He is knuckleheads.
Yeah. Remember what John the Baptist's disciples said the first time they came to Jesus? Are you the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? And that's kind of what's going on here with the disciples. It's like, well, now wait a minute here. This isn't right. It's almost like they have a checklist. They have a checklist, and Jesus isn't checking any of the boxes. And like, what is going on with this? What's going on with this? And again, we got to give them some credit. They have nothing really to go on except what Jesus has been telling them. But Jesus has been confirming what he's been telling them through the performance of miracles. Miracles that other people can't do. Nobody can cure leprosy. Jesus did. Nobody can raise people from the dead. Jesus did. But still, they go, wait a minute. This is not right. And note, though, that the command, he's done this before. Don't tell anybody about this. He's done that when he's healed people. But this one has a time limit. Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Because at that moment, then, Peter, James, and John will understand what it is they saw, which was a picture, an image, a vision of Jesus glorified. They've seen what awaits Jesus on the other side of the cross. Now, wouldn't it be great, if you're the disciples, wouldn't it be great if Jesus could get all the glory with none of the sacrifice? Wouldn't that be awesome? If we could get all the glory with no sacrifice involved. That's really what they want. All glory, no sacrifice. Because they're not thinking about, even when they're thinking about Jesus coming into his kingdom, they're not thinking about the battle. They're thinking about the reward. Remember? James and John is their mother came to Jesus and said, when you come into your kingdom, will you let one of my sons sit on your right and one on your left? What kind of chutzpah was that? And the disciples do the same thing. All they're thinking about is who's going to be on his right and who's going to be on his left when the kingdom comes, not how are we going to get there. Right? So all about reward, nothing about sacrifice. They'll get it. They will get it. So I love this. So he makes this statement, right? Again, until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. They hear the dead part. They don't hear the raised part. And they're confused. So they do what everyone does when they're confused and they don't want to explore the reason for their confusion. They change the subject. Right? You've got to play with the language and play with the wording. And in Greek, right? So in NIV it says, the disciples asked him, why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first, as if this follows the other? It's not really the best way to translate it. A better way would be, so why do the teachers of the law do this? Right? Changing the subject. Not addressing what Jesus has just said, but now going back to what Peter and James and John have seen. They've seen Elijah and Moses, but they're more concerned about Elijah. So they ask him, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? So they're curious about it, because he's there and then he's not. But Elijah's supposed to come. He's connected to messianic expectations much more tightly than is Moses. In Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, specifically, explicitly prophesies that Elijah will reappear to proclaim the coming of the Messiah. And I love the way it's talked about. We'll get to that in the next verse. But again, their confusion arises from their struggle to reconcile their view of the Messiah, the traditional view of the Messiah and his role, and what Jesus has been saying about it. And it really does all come down to that basic issue of Jesus' death. Right? No talk of a revolution beforehand, only the talk of Jesus going to Jerusalem and being put to death. Something's not right. So they struggle. So there's a couple of rare moments in this chapter, one of which is this one in verse 11. Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. He's saying the scribes are right. Wait, what? They got it right, right? So he agrees Elijah must come first. And he agrees with Elijah's role as spelled out in Malachi chapter 4. I love this. So he agrees with the teaching, just not the interpretation. Malachi 4:6 declares that Elijah will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents. So that's a poetic way of describing the work of reconciliation. Right? To talk about reconciling children to their parents and parents to their children is to talk about reconciling God and his people. Okay? So again, what did John the Baptist do when he arrived? Right? He announced the coming of the Messiah, and he said, repent and believe. Prepare yourselves, right? Get ready by turning to God, right? Being reconciled to God is how Paul describes it in one of the Corinthian letters. So he understands why that Elijah was to come, and Elijah had a responsibility to prepare people for, well, actually Elijah's role was to prepare people for the judgment, right? So we have to think about this again, pre-cross and resurrection, when in the economy of Jewish theology, they're thinking about the only way to assure yourself of salvation is by doing all the right things, right? So to prepare the people to face judgment is to help get the people ready for what they hope will be a favorable judgment, right? So get back on track with God. So he makes these very clear statements about what Elijah is supposed to do, and then in verse 12 he finally shows his hand. I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, and have done to him everything they wished, in the same way the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So remember, back in chapter 16, Jesus asked the disciples, who do the people say that I am? What'd they say? Some say Elijah. Others, John the Baptist. Others, one of the prophets. And when people came out to question John the Baptist, there were many people who thought he was Elijah. He fit the bill. He dressed appropriately. He talked appropriately. He checked all the boxes. But people didn't want to believe he was Elijah because that would upset the apple cart, right? But he says, but I tell you, and anytime you see that in the Gospels, Jesus is issuing a correction about the scribal interpretation. And again, there were many of Jesus' contemporaries that believed that John the Baptist was Elijah right up until the moment he got his head chopped off. But even after that, because John did what he was supposed to do. And so they're good with that. They understand, okay, John the Baptist was Elijah, we get that, but we really don't get the rest of it. Because then he says, in the same way the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. And that's the part where their ears shut off. Because again, what? Wait, what? John the Baptist got his head cut off. What do you mean? Is that going to happen to you? Right? They don't want that. That doesn't work. That doesn't fit their expectations. So, again, that stubbornness walks with the disciples all the way up until the resurrection, really. Really. Because Peter was ready to cash in his chips and go home when he was standing out there in the courtyard of the high priest while Jesus was on trial. I don't know him. What do you mean? Right? Then, yeah. And then after he rises from the dead and they go off to Galilee, Peter says, let's go fishing. Right? So he's like, let's get back to normal. All right, so again, the transfiguration, you want to sum up the transfiguration, right? The transfiguration is meant to affirm Jesus' identity as Messiah, to affirm Jesus' interpretation of what the Messiah must undergo, and to give the disciples a glimpse of what Jesus will look like on the other side of the cross and the resurrection. Jesus glorified. Okay? So those are all of a piece that are meant to encourage the disciples now as they continue their journey south. So as we move into the next section, we'll get just a little bit of this done. As they move into the next section, we have 3 brief passages that basically just carry us from this transfiguration event to Jesus' entrance into Judea. But they are things that continue to focus in on Jesus' identity as the Messiah and what that means. Now, a lot of people ask, where did this next event take place? You can make a pretty good case for the fact that he is in Galilee at this point, somewhere near Capernaum. But verse 14 says, when they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. So they've journeyed down the mount, right? Is this all 3? Is this just the 3 disciples? Is this all 12 disciples? We don't know. But whatever the case, right? It might, well, anyway, we'll get to it. Jesus only took 3 with him, so where are the rest? They're hanging out with the crowd. But apparently they were also busy. So anyway, this man approaches Jesus, kneels before him, and verse 15, Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. Interesting, we're going to learn in verse 18 that the reason for these seizures was demon possession. Now, of course, scholars like to go back and try to figure out, so what was this actual condition? What was his actual medical condition? And most scholars say, well, it must have been epilepsy, based on the description. So there's only one problem with that. in Greek religious circles, non-Jewish circles, epilepsy was actually considered to be a divine gift.
Or tell that to the person that has it and swallows their tongue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They understood these kinds of things as evidence of divine possession. Not necessarily demonic possession, but divine possession. Okay? The Greeks did. Now the Jews come along and they got no truck with that. They understand that any kind of possession by anything other than the Spirit of God is demonic possession. They use a different word here. A different word here. Not the word that the Greeks traditionally used for epilepsy. So it takes it out of the realm of disease and puts it in the realm really of spiritual possession. And I think that's intentional. I really do. Because that's really the focus here. Although, again, there's no clear division between medical conditions and demonic possession in the Bible. No, it can be one, the other, or both in the minds of the ancients. So when it talks about Jesus casting out this demon, it characterizes it as an act of healing, and it was a spiritual healing, if nothing else. So when the man asks for mercy, right? That's the word almost always that people almost always connect with asking Jesus for help and healing, to show mercy. Because remember, in any case, much of the ancient world understood or believed diseases and other conditions to be the result of sin. Okay? And what they hoped for from God was mercy. Because in their minds, again, the forgiveness of sin and the healing of disease were connected. Make sense? I'm not saying we have to believe that way today. Please don't. We have a much more nuanced understanding of disease and how it functions. But in this world, they're seeing it as demonic possession, bringing it into the spiritual world, and using that word intentionally because we really are talking about power over demonic spirits here. I love the words. The Jewish word was applied sometimes to epilepsy, the Jewish word. But the actual word itself is a compound word that means affected by the moon.
That's where you get lunatic.
That's where you get the word lunatic. And I think the King James actually uses the word lunatic at some point to translate the word. Huh? You know what lunacy is, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it reflects that ancient belief that the moon could cause insanity, right? So, or the God associated with it. I love that. But again, the words are intentional, right? The words are intentional because it's meant to move us clearly into the realm of a spiritual condition, not a medical condition. Does that make sense? Because the clear issue here is power over demonic spirits. That's the issue. Now, so we have a man whose son is having seizures, who's demon-possessed, as we will learn. How did this man deal with it? Verse 16, I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. Right? Jesus isn't around, we'll go to the next best choice, the disciples. They can't do it. I wonder if there's a little bit of disappointment in that man's voice. Why couldn't they heal? Right? Think about this. He's already sent them out. Back in, I think, chapter 10, he's already sent them out with authority to do what? To heal, to cast out demons, to heal diseases, cast out demons, to do all those things. We have no report that they actually did that, but we're told that they have the power. So they couldn't do it. And here we see, I guess what I would call an uncharacteristic moment of frustration on Jesus' part. Right? You unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Right? Now, you really do want to hear frustration in that, right? That Jesus is expressing this appropriate frustration Because all he's done and all he's said, it's like, you should be able to cast out a demon for crying out loud. You know, you should be able to do it. So but he doesn't take his frustration out on the man, right? But he takes it out on this unbelieving and perverse generation. I love that. Talking about all the people who are unwilling to receive and believe his message. And the disciples fall into that, not in terms of believing what he can do in terms of healing and casting out demons, but believing him when he says he must die to save the world, right? Not conquer to save Israel. So, and the word that's translated unbelieving can refer to something that is incredible or unbelievable, or someone who is without faith, or someone who is deliberately unwilling to believe someone or something. And it can be translated faithless. And that's how King James does it, the ESV, the New Revised, they translate it as faithless. He says, you faithless and perverse generation. That's actually probably more accurate in the context, because what Jesus is going to take issue with now here is the disciples' lack of faith.
That's Jesus' frustration.
Yeah, hence his frustration. It's almost like, when are you going to finally get it? Right? And it's not because they can't. Right? Again, it's not because they can't understand it. It's because they won't. Right? And it's not as much deliberate as it is the struggle that they have with letting go of their preconceptions about Jesus. Right? So, I advocate, every time you read the Gospels, read them like you're reading them for the first time. Set aside anything you think you know about it, anything you think you believe about it, and just let the Bible speak. Right? Because it's a living word. It will reveal to us things that we didn't know were there. Right? Still happens to me 35 years after I was ordained. I'm still turning to Scripture and reading it and finding new things in it. So, yeah, it never gets done. So, disciples can't do it. Verse 18, Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. Woohoo! Right? So, intentional contrast. The disciples' failure, Jesus' immediate success. Right? And a healing that's obvious. A healing that's obvious. Obvious, probably, first of all, by the fact that the man's son, was once more able to speak. We never see in the Bible account any possessed person who comes to Jesus asking to be healed. Because the implication is that the demon that's possessing the person will prevent them, if not from talking, certainly from asking for help. So the implication here is that the boy, the man, whoever it is, who's healed, he's able to speak clearly, and it's undeniable that he's been healed, and that's an important aspect of the account, right? So Jesus has power over demons, and will tell them that they have the same power. So these last couple of verses, and then we'll call it. Verse 19, then the disciples came to Jesus in private. Don't you love that? So let's not talk about our failure in front of God and everybody. Let's go talk about this. Let's go talk about this privately. They're ashamed. They're ashamed, right? But they want to know, why couldn't we do it? And that is certainly a valid question, right? And it's a valid question because Jesus, he answers it validly, right? Why couldn't we do it? And he replied, because you have so little faith. True.
That is misused now.
Oh my gosh, it is, yeah. If you, yeah. Yeah, so let me clear that up for you, right? If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Yeah, that's taken out of context and just abused, right? Because when Jesus talks about faith, right, it's not. Where is our faith based? In whom is our faith based? Our faith is based in God, right? And remember, all these conversations we've been having about Jesus' miraculous deeds, it's understood to be the power of God flowing through Jesus. So it's not having faith in my power to do something, it's having faith in God's power to do something. And if I have just a little bit of faith in God's power to do something, God can do amazing things in and through me. But the full faith thing is the disciples may have reached a point in their life and ministry where they thought, well, I have the power. No, you don't have the power. God has the power. You're the conduit, not the source. Does that make sense? And the other piece of it is, right, when Jesus talks about faith, we have to recontextualize it. He's talking about God gives you the faith to do the things that God wants you to do. Right? If I was just to walk out on a rare, clear day in the summer and look over at one of the mountains and say, "Mountain, move," the mountain wouldn't move because there's no purpose in it. Why are you moving mountains around? Right? And the idea of moving mountains through faith, again, is a figurative phrase within Judaism. Not to say we couldn't do it. If God decided a mountain needed to be moved and wanted you to do it, you're going to do it. Clearly. But the idea of moving mountains or doing something improbable or impossible is a rabbinic way of looking at faith. But Jesus returns to that image of the mustard seed, that tiny little seed that produces a huge bush, to talk about how much a little faith can do amazing things.
To me, it's just like a poetic thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just like love being used in love's like a rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
So your faith is, can move mountains. To me, it's more poetic. I mean, I really don't say like, oh, you can really move mountains.
Mhm.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Actually, it's just a wonderful way of saying how it is your faith is.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a mountain physically sitting out there on the horizon to be moved. It could be your mountain of doubt
Mhm.
or fear or anger, like we had in the ladies' Bible study, or all kinds of other mountains that trap and put you down,
Yeah.
that need to be moved,
Yeah.
as opposed to the physical things that we love to watch the sunset on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I mean, to look at the Gospels to understand that all of these faith statements about what is possible through faith must be understood within the context of doing the will of God. That whenever Jesus makes one of these promises, it's always a promise in that context and not just a general promise, right? So to say that your faith can't accomplish anything is actually right. My faith can't accomplish anything. God's faith working through me can accomplish anything, right? So again, it's a matter of not telling God what God should do, but asking God, what should I do? And knowing that if God tells me to do something, God's going to give me the power to do it, even if it seems impossible from my side of it. Okay? My own example has always been, I am an off-the-chart introvert. I was terrified of public speaking when I grew up. In speech class, I got physically ill before I had to get up and give my presentation, right? And when God said, I want you to get up and talk and teach people and talk to people, I'm like, yeah, no. And God laughed, right? So God can do amazing things, right? If we let Him. And again, it's always within that context of living out the gospel. So again, I love what you said, Carol. I think that in the underlying message to the disciples here is that if you will believe what Jesus is saying about His suffering and death, right, your faith will carry you through that to see if you understand what's waiting you on the other side. So again, the point is that the disciples were unable to cast out this demon because they forgot that the source of their power was God, not them. So that's why they couldn't cast out demons. But God can cast out demons, right? And God can cast out demons through them. So God can do anything. With God, everything is possible. That doesn't mean God will do everything. It means God can do everything. Got that? That's a principle of recovery, by the way, that I hammer on. Not that God can, or not that God, will, but that God can. Not that God will, but that God can. There you go.
It reminds me of our prayer too, our prayer to the Lord. I mean, you wait and you patiently waiting,
Mhm.
I pray and my Lord, you're not answering.
Yeah.
So that's kind of reflects me about.
Yeah. I love to think about the Gethsemane prayer here, right? Where Jesus says, if it is your will, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. Recognizing that God could save him from the cross. Not that he will, but that he could. Right? Make sense? All right.
Well, sometimes when